Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of Employment Services and Education at the Fortune Society. And welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlights the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune Society. Today's show is entitled The Color of Money. In an article published by the New York Times, it was reported that black families in America earn just $57.30 for every $100 in income earned by white families. And for every $100 held in white family wealth, black families hold just $5.04. This racial wealth gap exists even among black people who are highly educated and come from two-parent homes. Black families with graduate or professional degrees have $200,000 less in wealth than similarly educated whites. So what accounts for these racial disparities in wealth? How do we meaningfully address it? In raising the minimum wage to $15 in New York, a step in the right direction? I'm honored to have a wonderful guest with me today, Stacy Woodruff. Stacy is the Managing Director at Workforce Professional Training Institute. Stacy has spent the past decade critically assessing and identifying best practices in workforce development, translating those findings into practical guidance for practitioners and their funders. Stacy holds a master's degree in public administration from New York University's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service and a master's degree in sociology from Penn State University. Thank you for joining us today, Stacy. How are you feeling today?
I'm well. Thank you, Andre. Happy to be here.
Great. So, I mean, we'll kind of like jump right into it. We know that the racial gap exists, like even among black people who are highly educated and coming from two-parent homes for black families, and it's different, obviously, for white families. So what I want to do is just dive right into it, Stacy,
Sure.
right? So, like, many people believe that greater education attainment on the part of black and Hispanic communities will close the racial gap. And, like, what are your thoughts on this approach to addressing this issue?
Sure. So to step back and set some of the context, you have been framing looking at the issue of wealth. And in some of the studies that you've cited, much other research, you can look back and you can documented how wealth is typically passed down through generations. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at some of the wealth gap, the disparities between white families and black families or Hispanic families, and you reflect on the changes over the last few decades in terms of civil rights and hopefully equaling the playing field, at least on a legal ground, you have to remember that the time that it takes to really catch up and to start to accumulate wealth, to begin to pass that wealth across generations, decades are insufficient in terms of really being able to make up for what in some cases has been centuries of wealth accumulation, especially among white families. So when you have entire classes of individuals that were structurally and systematically barred, for example, from educational opportunities, sometimes employment opportunities, from banking and housing and other things that have been really drivers of wealth at this time, as well as across generations, you can see how starting from zero, even if you're using your starting point as the mid 1960s, it takes time to build up. To you think about your own goals in terms of starting from zero versus having, I guess, the power of accumulation over time or compounded interest, for example. Sure. So I think just again stepping back and recognizing as much as we have made strides, legally in this country, we know that implementation is uneven, and we know that access to education and employment, and good education and good employment is not going to be equal across all individuals. So wanted to just lay that context out to begin with.
Which I think is a very important context. You know, a common sense hypothesis is that, you know, you ascribe wealth attainment to obviously higher education or education generally, when we know that that's like a myth oftentimes, right? That people, you know, because they may have this higher education doesn't mean necessarily they're going to have this equity in wealth per se. And so, you know, the other thing is I just wanted to talk about, you know, we talk about what are your thoughts around the approach to addressing this issue. What do you think are some of the things that obviously can be done to kind of address equity around like that the income disparity?
Sure. Well, to focus back on education and thinking about education, again, quite a bit of research has been conducted. And I want to point to a couple of local programs that are thinking about, so even if Black and Latino individuals are getting through high school and getting into higher education at similar rates as white individuals, their persistence rates in college are lower, and so keeping people in school, and that is, you know, can stem from a number of factors. Sometimes yes, it is preparedness, but also financial and other barriers trying to balance work and education. And so a program here in New York City out of the City University of New York, the ASAP program, that really focuses on getting individuals into associate's degree programs and helping them persist and graduate within, if not 2 years, within 2 or 3 years. Community college graduation rates are pretty much abysmal across the board, or have been historically, and so this is a program that started off as a pilot program a few years ago with a handful or a relative handful of students, and now has expanded to, I want to say, upwards of about 20,000 students across CUNY schools enrolled in ASAP, with one college, Bronx Community College, adopting ASAP as a model for everybody who comes into the school. This is something that has happened with support from the city, from City Council, and flexible dollars that come in to provide those wraparound and really those supportive services. But understanding that that is one way that can help targeted interventions in terms of getting people through education, and so getting those degrees. But as we've talked about, or as you alluded to before, the education in itself, that degree isn't necessarily going to be the thing that makes the difference. So,
I know when we were actually like off air, we mentioned this idea about networking and the importance of social networks. Talk to us about that, the importance of social networks relative to this disparity in like wealth. And how does that jibe with that?
It's so we were talking a little bit about just the intergenerational transfer of wealth, and yes, that has to do with assets such as property, cash, other kind of tangible things. But what I don't think necessarily gets as much attention, or isn't as teased out in the research, is also those intergenerational transference of social networks and social capital. And so that is pretty critical when you're looking at education. So access to education, where you go to school, but also on the other end, and how do you, when you're in the labor market, how are you able to navigate through the labor market through those social networks? It's something I think I personally have taken a step back, and you think about your career trajectory and how you've gotten jobs, and I think honestly I can say oftentimes that has been maybe not that I know the person who is hiring me, but someone was able to vouch for me. So it's that sociological concept, the strength of weak ties, knowing that having those those networks that yes are deep and kind of thick and direct connect, but also are branching out to lots of other different types of people that can be tapped into. That is something that I think is not necessarily given kind of all of the attention that it should, but is critical. And when we think about going back to the topic, thinking of the wealth gap and thinking about the evenness or unevenness of opportunity, when you are, for example, when you're in a highly segregated school district or neighborhood, the types of networks that you are exposed to or involved in are also likely to be pretty segregated and more limited. And so when you're a young adult and you're looking for employment, not being able to tap into necessarily some of those networks that could lead you to take advantage of that education that you got, that degree you got, and really put you kind of in the sphere of being a contender for certain jobs. So it's I think we could certainly probably reflect on our own experiences and also the value, for example, in the context of a workforce development program of exposing those individuals who are going through it to different work experiences, to different work environments, to a variety of people. So how do you start to build those social capital networks?
It's important too, and there was a recent study, a report called Family Achievements, How a College Degree Accumulates Wealth for Whites and Not for Blacks.
Right.
And on average, it talks about the author maintains and posits that a black household with a college-educated head has less wealth than a white family whose head did not even obtain a high school diploma. And it takes a postgraduate education for a black family to have comparable levels of wealth to a white household with some college education or associate's degree. So, what are your thoughts on that, Stacy?
So focusing on, again, I think just going back to the differences in how families are able to translate some of that wealth. I mean, I think looking to education and looking to employment, and again, setting the context for where we are, and again, knowing that education should matter, that should be the great equalizer, but we see that it isn't. Again, employment, to step back and set a little bit of the context, we currently are at a point historically where the unemployment rate is lower than it's been in decades. So nationally is hovering around 4%, similar in New York City and New York State. How that translates into the labor market. So we also see in New York City, and again in New York State, since the Great Recession, month after month adding new jobs to the labor market. So jobs are being created. People are attaching to employment. The unemployment rate tells you one piece of the story. So when we say 4% unemployment rate, that 4% encompasses people who are trying to work, they're actively looking for work, but haven't managed to attach to the labor market. It covers up individuals, for example, who would like to be working but are discouraged or have dropped out of even looking for
or formerly
incarcerated.
Even.
And formerly incarcerated,
Right.
I think a number, research has documented a number of formerly incarcerated fall in that in that category. But I bring that up, I think it's important to say, with the economic context right now and low unemployment and record number of jobs, this is a real opportunity to to bring more people, and especially those who might have been discouraged, back into the labor market, including the formerly incarcerated. I think of a story I saw a couple of years ago in Wisconsin that even a couple of years ago, the state unemployment rate was, I think, just above 3%. And they were becoming desperate, saying, we're trying to find workers. And so what did they do? They said, well, let's turn to the jail and the prison systems.
Right.
We might have people here that would be interested in and amenable to training opportunities so that when they're released, they can walk right into a job. That's one, I think you could say that they did it out of desperation, but being in that state, saying we have a strong economy relatively, how do those of us who are thinking about these issues say, yes, absolutely, this is your chance to look at a talent pool that maybe gets overlooked, or just because of history or prejudices or just otherwise there are sometimes unreasonable, I guess, restraints put on who can and who cannot be employed in certain fields. And so employers are having to step back and say, maybe we need to reassess our policies, and should we have a blanket, for example, policy against anyone with a criminal background, or can we weigh those decisions based on other pieces of information?
And that's important too. And there's some employees, however, that they may need to be forced, right? And you have to kind of like engage employers and hold them accountable based on the law. And so most recently, the Fortune Society had a settlement against Target, or Target, depending on how you pronounce it, corporation, and it involved hiring like 2 experts to reform Target's national hiring policies because they had discriminated against people who were formerly incarcerated. And so, when we're talking about like remedying some of the discrimination or discriminatory practices from corporations and organized groups and businesses like Target or Target, it's important that we hold them accountable too. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
That is, I'm glad you brought that example to my attention. And yes, you're right. Sometimes it does require the force of law or bringing a lawsuit forward in order to get employers to take a step back. I guess, luckily, Target has proven to be an employer that is, I think, on the cutting edge when you look at, for example, their policies around raising the minimum wage organization-wide or company-wide across the country, regardless of local laws, or some of their policies around LGBTQI populations. And so where those lessons can be called from when they were looking at the data, for example, and were those systematic forms of discrimination, were they more localized to certain stores? I think being able to share that type of information with other corporations, large and small, businesses large and small, to say, this is a chance to really step back and understand that, the decisions that we make, sometimes, do require really reassessing. Is this, why was this the policy to begin with, or why was this policy unevenly implemented across the entire business?
And so, like, many of the jobs that people previously were denied will now be offered, maybe at Target and other companies, and that's because of the advocacy work that's being done. How do you think raising the minimum wage may or may not help address these issues?
Sure. Once again, I'll set some context. This is an area that I've been looking at for close to the past 2 years in terms of the minimum wage increase in New York City and New York State. New York State actually has one of the most complex sets of minimum wage increase schedules across the country. But just to hit the high level numbers, so in New York City, $15 per hour is the minimum wage for businesses that employ 11 or more employees. It's currently $13.50 per hour for those smaller businesses in New York City. In Westchester County and in Long Island, it is $12 an hour. And across the state, the rest of the state, it's $11.10 per hour. There is a differential in the rest of the state where fast food workers are being paid $12.75 per hour right now. So you can see it's kind of across the board. And that wage, so where where the wage is not $15 per hour right now, over time it will eventually hit 15, with all employers in New York City hitting $15 an hour at the end of this year. So in preparing for that change, and that, as I mentioned, that change came from the state, not from the city. Right. A couple of research outfits conducted some research in 2015 or 2016 as the increase was being contemplated, and actually came up with some estimates of who would be impacted, to what degree they would be impacted. And so one research study out of the Economic Policy Institute, for example, estimated that a total of, by 2021, when the minimum wage is projected to reach $15 an hour across the state, right, a total of 3.2 million New Yorkers will be impacted directly by that wage increase. Sizable. About 1.4 million of those individuals are in New York City, which is roughly a quarter of our workforce. Sure. When you look at the demographic breakdown, it's estimated that I think around a third of Black New Yorkers will be impacted by that increase. Or, sorry, I should say a third of the people impacted are African American. But when you look, if you look just within the population of African Americans in the labor market, about 40% will be impacted, and just over half of Latinos will be impacted. So this is, has real potential to impact the wages of individuals, of families. Again, with some of this research, the estimate was that, so taking when the wage in 2015 was $9 an hour and moving up to $15 an hour, that the average person who started in that $9 an hour job, if they stayed in that same job, again, lots of assumptions, that they would be earning close to $5,000 more per year by the time the wage hit 15. So great possibility in terms of really changing the economic picture. However, remember, $15 an hour in a city like New York City still doesn't get you very far. Sure. So when I say that 40% of New Yorkers, of African American New Yorkers, are impacted by that, then that gives you a sense of how many people are working at jobs that pay at or near the minimum wage. And so where do we start to say, okay, that's great, that's a policy that really impacts people, puts more money in their pockets, but how do you look at making sure that people are moving up from those jobs, or have access to jobs that pay more than the minimum to begin with, and have the potential for wage growth and for benefits and everything else that comes with what we would define as a good job. Sure.
And what is one suggestion you'd like to make for our country to tackle our growing wealth and inequity issues?
I have the fortune of being able to speak with and work with people from across the country. And in thinking about this, I mean, the wage gap and gaps in wealth, they're huge issues, and they're systemic, as I mentioned. I think there is a growing set of cities and others that are really starting to take head on the issue of equity and build it into how the city approaches workforce or education or other issues. One that comes to mind would be Minneapolis, St. Paul, or the Twin Cities. And just to get reflecting on some work I did about 7 years ago, both officials at the city and in the philanthropic community were starting to ask that question. They were looking at the data and they said, in the Twin Cities, we have comparatively high rates of educational attainment, and they also had, I think, some of the most significant gaps in terms of employment racially. And so they said, how do we deal with this? And so it took them a couple of years, but really had to say, yes, we want to commit to making equity a piece of what we do, and recognizing that committing to equity means that you might have to, in order to achieve equal outcomes, you might need to provide extra services or give extra attention to certain populations. But I think it's making that commitment and saying this is something that we need to do in order to move forward as a city, as a society, and also this can help us use limited resources in the best way. So I think it's not to say that we're not doing that in New York City, but I would say if we could push to look at to be more like the Twin Cities, or work is going on in Chicago and Philadelphia, other places where they're starting to take head on the issue of racial equity and have, I think, data informed and very, honest conversations.
Stacy, thank you so much. Are any last thoughts you'd like to leave our viewers with?
These are, as I've said, these are very structural issues that sometimes, not everybody's in the weeds thinking about these. I'm in a position where I do look at those issues day in and day out. I can look at the way that data can inform what we do or help us, think about these issues and really use those as solutions and use data to come up with solutions. But honestly, having conversations like this and thinking about the role of education and employment and how that plays into what we still see as the American dream in terms of building wealth and building a stable foundation for you and your family. Can just keep having these conversations.
Thank you so much. Well, in closing, this has been a thought-provoking discussion. Stacy, thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you to the viewers tuning in. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Andre Ward, and I appreciate you joining us as we are critically looking at both sides of the bars.